The panorama of Tokyo in the 1860s looks almost dreamlike. Wooden houses stretch across the horizon, temples rise in calm dignity, and the city feels locked in a timeless rhythm. Compare this to London, Paris, or New York of the same decade, where steamboats churn the waters, trains whistle across iron bridges, and factories belch smoke into the sky. While industrialization roared across Europe and North America, Japan still lived in a world of feudal lords, the daimyo and knightly samurai. It was a medieval society surviving in a modern age. And yet, within just 80 years, Japan would have trams, cars, railways, aircraft carriers, vast cargo ships, and a colonial empire stretching across Asia. By the 1940s, the average Japanese was as wealthy as the average Italian. No other non-Western nation had ever done this before. Japan became the first to catch up with the West, a symbol for others, Korea, Taiwan, Greece, who would try to follow its path. For over a century, the world has often looked at Japan to see how to fix its own problems. So how did they do it? This is the story of Japan's rise, its fall, and its rise again. The years before industrialization are remembered as the Tokugawa period. This was the era when Japan sealed itself off. Ordinary people were forbidden to leave the country. Foreigners were banned. Trade with the outside world was strictly limited. Yet, Japan was never completely cut off. In Nagasaki, Dutch ships were allowed to dock and trade. Diplomatic embassies were maintained with Korea, and Japanese scholars studied European books on the latest inventions. For instance, in the late 18th century, Japanese craftsmen built intricate clocks based on Dutch texts explaining clockworks. By the 1850s, Japan even had a unique clock based on the Japanese calendar. Isolated, yes, but never blind to the wider world. In 1852, the Dutch warned Japan of something that would change everything. A fleet of American warships was on its way. The following year, these black-hulled steamships appeared, bristling with cannons that fired explosive shells designed to set wooden cities ablaze. Tokyo, then called Edo, was almost entirely built of wood. The message from the American commander was clear. Here is a list of demands. We will return in 1 year, and if Japan refuses, its capital will burn. Japan had long built coastal defenses. Cannons guarded the approaches. But these cannons had short range, designed for another age. American guns could sit far out at sea, beyond reach, and still bombard Japan's cities. The realization was terrifying, and the Americans were only the beginning. A month later, Russian battleships arrived, making the same demands. Soon after, the British did the same. Why the sudden attention? The answer lay not in Japan, but in China, and in coal. Look at the trade routes of the 19th century. The Atlantic was crisscrossed with commerce. Europe, Africa, the Americas. But the Pacific, it was a vast, empty ocean. Ships sailing to China often had to go around Africa, because crossing the Pacific was so risky. Winds could die, leaving ships stranded with no food or water. Then came the steamship, a revolution. Steamships did not depend on wind, but they did depend on coal. A ship could burn through its coal in just 2 weeks. To cross the Pacific reliably, ships needed refueling stations. And there was Japan, sitting right next to China, with rich coal deposits, perfectly placed along the American and European routes. The West did not care about Japan for Japan's sake. They wanted coal to reach China more profitably. And so they arrived with cannons, demanding ports, trade rights, and access. From Japan's perspective, this was catastrophic. For centuries, foreign ships had come, and Japan had turned them away. Russians in 1778, the British in 1808, Americans in 1837. But now the West's ships could incinerate entire cities from beyond Japanese range. The shogunate faced a terrible choice: burn or surrender its isolation. They chose surrender. Between 1854 and the 1860s, Japan was forced to sign 11 treaties with foreign powers. These treaties were humiliating. Embassies were established on Japanese soil. Certain ports were forced open. Foreigners could live and work without restriction, immune from Japanese law. If a foreigner committed a crime, he was tried not in Japan, but in his own nation's courts. And Japan was forbidden to tax foreign trade. Imagine it, a government powerless to decide who could enter its land, powerless to enforce its own laws, powerless even to levy taxes. For 15 bitter years, resentment grew. One treaty after another stripped Japan of dignity. By 1868, the people had had enough. The shogunate was overthrown. The old order had failed. A new one would rise, determined to save Japan. The young Emperor Meiji became the symbol of this new age. His government had one goal: survival. They looked at the Aztecs, at India, at the Ottomans, great nations crushed, colonized, or carved apart. Japan swore it would not share that fate. Japan would remain independent. But how? The answer came unexpectedly from an inventor. When the Russians visited in 1853, they demonstrated a steam engine. Inspired, Tanaka Hijashich studied Dutch texts and built one of his own, the first in Japan. From there, he created Japan's first locomotive and steam-powered warship. His workshop would one day merge with another to form a company known today as Toshiba. The lesson was clear. Japan's weakness lay not in spirit, but in technology. The West's cannons, steamships, and rifles had overwhelmed them. If Japan wanted to survive, it had to master those same technologies. The new government launched an extraordinary plan: copy Western institutions as fast as possible. Isolationism was abandoned. Foreigners and their ideas were welcomed. A central government was created. Economic plans were drawn. In short, Japan set out to make Japan great again. But they faced a challenge. Industrialization required factories, machines, and expertise. Private entrepreneurs like Tanaka had brilliance and drive, but not money. Japan was still a pre-industrial economy, with little to trade for costly Western machines. The only entity with enough wealth was the government. So a partnership was born. The government would provide capital, and skilled professionals would provide knowledge. Hokkaido became the first great experiment. Japan feared that Russia, fresh from seizing Vladivostok in 1858, might claim Hokkaido next. To prevent colonization, the government established the Hokkaido Development Board in 1869. They hired the former U.S. Commissioner of Agriculture to modernize farming. Western seeds and livestock were introduced. An agricultural college was built to spread the knowledge. Canals, windmills, roads, and ports transformed the land. Scientists experimented with crops. Mines were dug, railroads laid. The surplus wheat and rye even gave birth to one of Japan's first breweries. Sapporo beer, still sold today. The system became a model. Government funded, professionals managed, and once industries became self-sustaining, they were handed to private hands. Trains, steelworks, shipyards, textiles, all followed this path. By the 1880s, conferences on cotton spinning inspired a wave of new factories. And unlike other nations, Japan kept its wealth at home. Loans came from Japanese financiers, not foreign banks. Profits stayed in Japan, reinvested in more factories, more railroads, more industry. Companies like Mitsui 1876 and Mitsubishi 1870 grew into giants. Shiseido 1872 began as a pharmacy, later becoming one of the world's leading cosmetics firms. Taisei Corporation 1873 built the Imperial Palace and even helped construct Dubai's artificial islands in the 21st century. Yet, for all this growth, the West still saw Japan as semi-barbarian. Japan longed to be treated as an equal. The breakthrough came in 1894. Britain, wary of Russia, sought an ally in East Asia. Japan agreed, but only if the humiliating treaties were renegotiated. Britain, needing Japan more than coal, agreed. For the first time, the world's greatest empire treated Japan as an equal. It was a turning point. Within years, Japan renegotiated every unequal treaty. Now, officially recognized as a great power, Japan did what all great powers of the age did: build an empire. With Britain's recognition, Japan stood tall at last. But with recognition came ambition. Every great power of that era built colonies, and Japan would do the same. First came the Ryukyu Kingdom in 1874, then nearby islands. Taiwan was seized from China in 1895. 10 years later, in 1905, Japan shocked the world by defeating Russia, taking South Sakhalin in the process. Korea was annexed in 1910. During the First World War, Japan captured German colonies across the Pacific. By 1931, it had conquered Manchuria. The empire expanded not only as a shield, making it harder for foreign powers to strike Japan itself, but as a resource base. Industrialization demanded food, coal, iron, and oil. Colonies were made to provide. And as in every empire, exploitation was brutal. Forced labor, massacres, the enslavement of women as comfort women, scars that remain bitter in Asia to this day. Yet, within Japan itself, life was improving. A parliament was created. Citizens voted. Judges were appointed to independent courts. A constitution was written. The strategy worked. Government support, selective industries, and colonial expansion lifted Japan into the ranks of the world's great powers by the eve of the Second World War. But ambition brought conflict. Japan's hunger for resources put it at odds with Western powers. In the 1930s, Japan clashed with China. By the 1940s, it was at war with the United States and European empires. The gamble failed. The war situation, as Emperor Hirohito admitted, had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. Japan lost. Its colonies were stripped away. Leaders stood trial at Tokyo for war crimes. And for the first time in history, Japan was occupied by a foreign power. The photographs from post-war Tokyo are haunting. Whole neighborhoods flattened, charred ruins stretching beyond the eye, millions homeless. In a single night of firebombing, over 100,000 souls perished. Japan was broken. The United States, now occupier, sought to ensure Japan could never again wage war. The first plan was political. Democracy was reintroduced. Local governments were given more power. School textbooks were rewritten. Over 200,000 officials deemed anti-democratic were purged. Yet the Americans knew little of Japanese society. In practice, much of the government remained in Japanese hands. The biggest change was cultural, teaching democracy, banning ultranationalism, removing fascist influences. But soon the Cold War began. Korea fell into Soviet and American camps. China became communist. Vietnam was aflame with revolution. Suddenly, the United States no longer wanted Japan weak. It wanted Japan strong, but in a different way. The new strategy was simple. Japan would have only a small self-defense military. U.S. troops would stay on Japanese soil, with Japan paying 75% of their costs. America gained a cheap army in Asia. Japan became dependent on America for security. And in return, Japan was freed to focus entirely on one thing: its economy. Without colonies, Japan turned to a different model, buying resources from allies, refining them at home, and selling manufactured goods abroad. This was the American style of capitalism, but perfected. In 1952, the U.S. occupation ended. Japan was free again and ready to grow. To grow, Japan adopted priority production, what economists now call comparative advantage. Focus on what you do best, sell it, and use the profits to buy the rest. But what did Japan do best? Geography held the answer. Japan is a chain of islands, narrow, mountainous, with people crowded into the coastal plains. This made public services more efficient. It also made exporting easy. Factories could send heavy goods to ports in hours, then ship them worldwide. The government first poured resources into essentials: coal, fertilizer, electricity. Then came steel, construction, heavy industry. With fuel, food, and power secured, Japan could build anything. By 1955, the economy was larger than before the war. Education became the cornerstone. Before the war, universities had been elite, reserved for the upper classes. But a modern economy needed masses of engineers, economists, and scientists. Japan invested heavily. By the 1970s, over 90% of students pursued high school and beyond, on par with the West. Many were sent abroad to learn the latest technologies, returning to companies eager to hire them. Japan protected its industries with import restrictions, giving its people the first chance to buy Japanese-made televisions, cars, and appliances. As skills grew, these products became cheaper and better than Western goods. By the 1970s, Japan was the great exporter of high-tech cars, VCRs, televisions. Western firms tried to break into Japan's growing consumer market, but their advertising, tailored for European and American cultures, failed to resonate with Japanese buyers. So Japanese companies dominated at home and used steady domestic profits to expand abroad. Efficiency became the national creed. Tokyo Bay became a nearly unbroken belt of industry. Steelworks, oil refineries, shipyards, power plants, and factories by the thousands. Factories specialized. One might make only screws, another only glass, another only engines. Each became world-class at its task, and together they built products unrivaled in cost and quality. The system, born in Japan, is now copied worldwide. By the 1980s, Japan faced a challenge. China, newly opened, was cheaper. Low-cost industries like textiles fled there. But Japan turned this to its advantage, sharing expertise and investment, and soon became China's largest trading partner. Meanwhile, life in Japan transformed. Houses grew larger, diets became richer. Life expectancy soared from 47 years in 1935 to 68 in 1960, 78 in 1990, and 84. The population boomed. 32 million in 1853, 70 million in 1935, 100 million in 1968, and a peak of 128 million in 2010. Then, for the first time, it shrank. An aging society, low birth rates, and a xenophobic reluctance to welcome immigrants left Japanese workers burdened with long hours, often 60 hours a week. Women entered the workforce in larger numbers, but barriers remained. Lower pay, fewer promotions, jobs seen as less prestigious. By the 1990s, only 10% of management positions were held by women. The glass ceiling cost Japan dearly, wasting talent that could have driven growth. By the 1990s, the miracle was over. Japan had caught up with the West, but now it could not simply copy. It had to innovate. And here, growth faltered. For 3 decades, the economy has stagnated. Theories abound, but no consensus exists. Japan remains the world's 3rd largest economy, yet its growth is frozen, its future uncertain. From a feudal society of samurai and wooden cities, to the steel and fire of empire, to the ashes of war, and finally, to the shining skyscrapers of a modern nation. Japan's journey is extraordinary. In just 160 years, it rose from isolation to power, from ruin to rebirth. And though today it struggles with stagnation, its lessons remain. Nations still look to Japan to learn, to imitate, to avoid mistakes. Its story is not just its own. It is a mirror of the world's future. So ends the tale of Japan's rise, fall, and rise again.